The snow fell quietly that night outside Winterfell's high stone walls, but inside the silence was colder than the winter winds. Ned Stark stood alone in the godswood, staring at the red leaves of the weirwood tree. His face was still, but his mind boiled. It had been over a decade since Robert Baratheon had sat on the Iron Throne, since they had toppled the Mad King together, since he had lied to the world and told them that Lyanna died at Rhaegar's hands. A lie that tasted more bitter each year. But what no one knew, what not even Catelyn suspected, was that Robert hadn't won the crown alone. No, he hadn't even survived the war alone. At the Battle of the Trident, when Robert lay crushed and dying beneath his horse, it was Ned who made the choice. He had seen the fear in Robert's eyes that day, the realization that he might die, and leave the rebellion broken. And in that moment Ned struck the final blow, not against Rhaegar, but against Robert's own honor. Rhaegar had been close to surrendering. There had been a whisper of peace, even a proposal. But Robert's hatred would never allow it. So Ned had made the choice to silence both kings, one sword stroke in the chaos of battle. Rhaegar fell, yes, but so did Robert's chance at a future that wasn't poisoned by vengeance. What the realm remembered was the hammer smashing Rhaegar's chest. What actually happened was hidden behind northern silence. After the war, Robert woke up healed, drunk, and blood-hungry. He never questioned Ned. He never knew that the only reason the rebellion didn't collapse that day was because Ned had lied again. Lied that Rhaegar fought like a demon, lied that Robert had landed the killing blow, lied about Lyanna's death, and lied about Jon Snow's parentage. And for what? Now, years later, the lies were decaying. Robert was king, yes, but unfit, drunk, dangerous. The realm was rotting under his rule. The Lannisters had their claws in him. Jon Arryn was dead, and Robert was riding north to Winterfell with the intent to make Ned his hand. It wasn't an offer, it was a trap. Ned knew what was coming. If he went south, he'd die. If he stayed, war would come anyway. So he had already begun to prepare, not for survival, but for conquest. In the crypt beneath Winterfell, where his family slept in stone silence, Ned had begun to store letters, maps, secrets, proofs. Ravens had already flown from the Dreadfort, from White Harbor, from Bear Island. He would not make the mistake of being loyal again. This time he would protect the North, not with honor, but with power. And there was Jon, not a bastard, not a Snow, the true heir, the blood of ice and fire. As the wind blew through the branches above him, Ned whispered a prayer, not to the old gods, but to Lyanna. Forgive me for what I'm about to do, because Robert Baratheon was coming to Winterfell, and this time Ned Stark would not kneel. The morning Robert arrived at Winterfell, the air was heavy, not just with cold, but with tension that no one could name. His arrival was loud, full of laughter, drums, and the sound of gold-trimmed armor. The king hadn't changed. His belly had grown, his face was red from drink, and his voice boomed with the confidence of a man who believed the world still turned at his command. But Ned Stark watched him with quiet calculation. He forced a smile when Robert dismounted and crushed him into a bear hug. But inside, he was already steps ahead. He had prepared the feast, dressed the hall, and welcomed the queen. But behind the curtains, his mind counted every Lannister guard that entered his home. Every one of them could be a knife in the dark. Cersei wore her disdain openly. She looked at Winterfell like it was dirt beneath her silk shoes. Her children were quiet, though Joffrey already had the smirk of someone who believed the world owed him blood. Ned kept his eyes on the boy. If the North was to rise, he had to know the threats that came with it. That night, during the feast, Robert pulled Ned into a drunken walk through the crypts. It was meant to be private, a moment of old friends, reconnecting, but Ned saw it for what it was, a test. As they passed the tombs, Robert paused at Lyanna's statue, his face softening with a pain only time had managed to dull, but not erase. "She should be with me," Robert whispered, "in the south, not buried in this frozen hole." Ned didn't answer. The old ache throbbed in his chest, but not for the reasons Robert thought. He looked at her stone face and remembered her voice, her plea, her final secret. Jon. "She belonged to no one, Robert," Ned said carefully. Robert turned to him, eyes narrowed slightly. "You've changed, old friend. You used to understand me better." "No," Ned said, barely a whisper. "I understood you too well." Later that night, while the halls of Winterfell echoed with laughter and wine-soaked songs, Ned met with Maester Luwin in the tower. The messages had been received. Lord Manderley had written back. He would stand with the North. So had the Umbers, and even House Glover. The Boltons, as always, had responded with a cryptic message, but Ned knew they'd join if the war was clear and blood would be spilled. "Jon is almost ready," Luwin said quietly. Ned turned to the fire. He didn't respond. Across the castle, Jon Snow trained in the yard with Robb. He didn't know what he was, not yet. But the war would change him. The next morning, Robert offered Ned the position of hand. Everyone watched with held breath. Catelyn's hand gripped her skirts. Cersei's eyes narrowed. Even Joffrey seemed to sense the weight in the silence, and Ned smiled. "I am honored," he said, bowing slightly, "but I must decline, Your Grace." The hall exploded in whispers. Robert stared at him, stunned. "You what?" "I cannot leave the North unguarded. With Jon Arryn gone, there are dangers in the capital I cannot risk nor trust." Robert's voice dropped. "We need you, Ned." Ned's eyes met his. "You needed me 10 years ago. Now you need someone who will nod and bow and keep quiet. That is not me." The silence that followed was colder than the northern air. Cersei smiled slightly, as if she had just won something. But she hadn't. Not yet. Because that night, Ned Stark began to send ravens again, not in secret this time, to every corner of the North, to Dorne, even to the Tullys. It was no longer about survival, it was about war. 2 days passed, and the king was no longer laughing. Robert stormed through Winterfell like a bear freshly wounded, snapping at servants, shouting at Lannister guards, and drinking deeper than even his old companions had ever seen. The insult still burned in his gut. Ned Stark had refused him, in front of the realm, in front of his wife, in front of his enemies. But worse than the insult was the fear, because deep in Robert's drunken mind, something twisted. He began to realize what Cersei had known from the moment Ned declined. The Warden of the North was no longer loyal. Cersei had wasted no time. That night, behind locked doors, she whispered poison into Robert's ear, her voice soft and cruel. "He's planning something," she said, gently touching his arm. "You know it. The North has never loved the throne. Maybe they never forgave you for what you did to their princess." "She wasn't theirs," Robert roared, the wine sloshing from his goblet. Cersei leaned in. "She wasn't yours either." The silence after that was deafening. Something broke in Robert's face. His lips trembled with a mixture of rage and pain, and Cersei smiled, sweet and slow, because now she had done it. She had planted the seed. Across the castle, Ned stood, on the battlements, looking out into the endless white. He had just received the final raven. Dorne would not move, but the Riverlands would. Hoster Tully had agreed to meet him in River Run, quietly. The old man was sick but not blind. If a war was coming, the Tullys would not be caught flat-footed. Ned turned to Theon, who stood at his side with wide eyes and restless energy. "You trust me, don't you?" Ned asked. Theon blinked. "Of course. You raised me." Ned's voice was low. "Then you'll ride south tomorrow, not to your father, to River Run. You'll tell Lord Tully this is not rebellion, not yet. But it is preparation. The North won't be caught sleeping again. Theon grinned. And if anyone stops me, kill them. He had never seen Theon look so serious. Meanwhile, Jon stood in the training yard, still thinking only of honor and wall duty, and earning the respect of men who would never give it. But Maester Luwin had begun dropping hints, subtle things, the way the blood of kings doesn't always wear crowns, the way truths are sometimes buried for protection. Jon didn't understand yet, but his mind was beginning to stir. That night, Sansa visited Arya in tears. She had overheard something, Cersei arguing with her father, shouting about traitors and bastards. Arya didn't understand most of it, but she knew when her sister was scared, and Sansa had never looked more frightened. Down in the Godswood, Ned knelt again at the weirwood tree, but this time he didn't pray. He planned. If Robert tried to force his hand, he would lose it. If Cersei tried to poison him, she'd be met with northern steel. And if the realm wanted war, then war they would have. But the one thing Ned couldn't prepare for was what happened next. Because that night, under the cover of darkness, ADID, Raven arrived from King's Landing. The wax seal was broken by Maester Luwin, who handed it to Ned with shaking hands. It wasn't just a letter, it was a warning, a scream from the grave. It was from Jon Arryn, dated weeks before his death. The seed is strong, the boy is not his. Ned stared at the words for a long time. Then finally he understood what kind of war was truly coming. This wasn't just about crowns or thrones. It was about the truth, and the truth would burn. Westeros to the ground. The Raven's message weighed heavy in Ned's hand, heavier than any sword he had ever lifted. The words scratched across the parchment burned into his memory. The seed is strong. The boy is not his. He sat in the dim light of his chambers, the fire flickering low, the chill creeping in through the stone walls. Outside, Winterfell slept, but inside Ned Stark was wide awake, piecing together a puzzle he had ignored for too long. Jon Arryn had died for this, not of sickness, not by age, but by knowledge, poisoned. Because he learned a truth too dangerous to live with. Ned reached for the small box in his drawer. Inside were old letters, names, birth dates, bloodlines, things he had collected quietly over the years while pretending not to care. The Baratheon line had always carried the same black hair, the same strong jaw, from Steffon to Robert, Stannis and Renly. But Joffrey was golden-haired. All three of Cersei's children were. And now, with Jon Arryn's final clue, the truth turned to Blade. The children were not Robert's. Ned sat back, the weight of it crashing into him. Not only were the heirs to the Iron Throne illegitimate, but the Queen had murdered the only man who found out. And now she was here, under his roof, surrounded by Lannister guards. If he revealed this truth now, Robert might lash out. A fury unmatched. Heads would roll, starting with Cersei's. But it wouldn't end there. Jaime Lannister would draw steel. Tywin Lannister would summon his bannermen. A civil war would rip the Seven Kingdoms in half, and the North would be caught in the storm. But if he stayed silent, he'd be complicit. And worse, he'd be vulnerable. Because Cersei was already watching him. She knew, or she suspected, and suspicion alone could be deadly. A knock at the door shattered the silence. Ned drew his dagger before he answered. It was Arya. "Father," she whispered, eyes wide. "There's a man in the yard. He's not wearing your colors." Ned stiffened. "What man?" "He said he came from the Vale. He wants to speak to you. Alone." Ned dressed quickly and followed Arya down to the keep's lower yard. It was nearly dawn, the first hint of sunlight bleeding into the frost-covered ground. The man was cloaked, hooded, but when he turned, Ned recognized the sharp eyes instantly. Peter Baelish. Littlefinger. "You're far from King's Landing," Ned said coldly. "And you're far too quiet for a man with fire in his hands," Littlefinger replied, smirking. Ned didn't return the smile. why are you here?" Littlefinger stepped closer, voice lowering. "Because you're sitting on a bomb, and I'm here to watch it explode. I've seen the letters, I know about the boy, and I know what you're thinking." "I doubt that." "Oh, come now. You want to protect the North. You want to save Jon. You want to avoid bloodshed. But you also want justice. And justice," he leaned in, his breath fogging in the air, "always costs blood. I'm not playing your games." Littlefinger's eyes sparkled. "Of course not. You're playing your own now." Before Ned could respond, the sound of swords clashing echoed from the opposite wall. Shouts followed. Steel on steel. Guards yelling. Something had gone wrong. Ned rushed toward the gate. What he saw turned his blood to ice. One of his men lay, dead in the snow, his throat slit. Another guard fought a Lannister knight, the lion sigil bright against his red cloak. At the center stood Jaime Lannister, his sword drawn, eyes cold and shining. He looked at Ned. "Your Grace," Jaime said mockingly, "you've been keeping secrets." Ned stepped forward slowly, pulling ice from his back. "You should have stayed in the capital. And you should have stayed in your role." Jaime's grin was vicious. "You see, I don't like secrets, and I don't like threats. My sister tells me you've been whispering treason. I think it's time we settled that." More Lannister guards began to circle. The snow crunched under boots. Winterfell was about to become a battlefield. And in that moment, Ned Stark made his choice. "Then let's speak the old way." Steel rang, blades clashed, and the coldest betrayal turned to fire. Steel screamed through the morning frost. Winterfell's courtyard erupted into chaos as swords clashed and men screamed. Jaime Lannister moved like a golden serpent, fast and precise, his blade singing with deadly grace. Ned Stark, slower but unshakable, met each blow with raw northern steel, ice, ancient and heavy, forged for moments just like this. The younger knights didn't know how to handle Ned's fury. For years he had buried the warrior inside him, beneath layers of calm, honor and restraint. But now it was loose, and he fought like a man with nothing left to lose. Jaime's smile slipped the first time Ned forced him back. "You've been hiding this, Stark," Jaime spat, circling. "All that honor was just armor, wasn't it?" "No," Ned growled, blood already staining his sleeve. "It was a chain. More guards rushed in, Stark men loyal to Winterfell, clashing against Lannisters, whose presence had always been a quiet insult. It was no longer quiet. Arrows flew. A stable boy was trampled. A bannerman of House Ryswell took a blade to the neck. The snow turned red. Inside the keep, chaos broke like a wave. Catelyn screamed for the children to be gathered. Maester Luwin tried to send ravens before the Lannister men reached the rookery. Sansa was weeping, confused, caught between fairy tale love and a blood-soaked truth. Arya, armed with only her wooden practice sword, had to be dragged back by Syrio Forel, who warned her in whispers, the wolf must learn to dance in silence. And Jon Snow, stood at the top of the stairs, watching it all, feeling the ground shift under his feet. He was still dressed in training clothes, but his eyes were different now. He looked at Cersei's guards spilling blood in Winterfell, and something ancient stirred inside him. Rage, yes, but more than that, purpose. Back in the yard, Ned caught Jaime across the chest. The Kingslayer stumbled, shocked. He'd underestimated the old wolf. "You're not supposed to fight like this," Jaime hissed. Ned advanced. "I was never supposed to fight my king either, but here we are." Just as he raised ice for the killing blow, a horn blared in the distance. Then another, then a third. The sound rolled like thunder across the plains. Riders were coming. Dozens, no, hundreds of banners approached from the east. House Umber, House Glover, House Karstark. The North had answered, and they were not flying Baratheon banners. Jaime looked around, fury rising. "You planned this." Ned stepped back, bloodied, breathing. Hard. You think I let you in here without knowing exactly how you'd act? Jaime lunged in desperation, but Robb tackled him from the side, his own sword gleaming with fresh blood. The young wolf fought like his father once had, fearless, silent, brutal. The battle turned in seconds. The Lannister guards, surrounded, overwhelmed, surrendered or died. Winterfell stood. Cersei was seized, dragged from her chambers, kicking and hissing like a feral cat. Her crown slipped from her hair, and the cold northern wind did not forgive pride. She spat at Ned as they brought her before him. "You think you've won," she snarled. "You think the realm will accept this betrayal?" Ned leaned close, speaking low so only she could hear. "They accepted your bastard children. They accepted your lies. Now they'll accept the truth." He turned to Maester Luwin. "Send word to Riverrun, the Eyrie, the Stormlands. Tell them what we know. Tell them the true heir lives." Behind him, Jon stood at the top of the stairs, the wind lifting his cloak, his eyes fixed on his father, no, his uncle, and everything he had once believed slowly crumbling. And yet, in the ashes of betrayal, a new fire began to burn. The North had risen. The war had begun, but for the first time the realm would hear the truth. The coldest betrayal was only the beginning.